Does God exist? Are science and faith enemies? Your host for this series was an atheist who became a believer in God through his studies in science. Here is public high school teacher John Clayton.
I'd like to welcome you to the Does God Exist series of materials dealing with the existence of God. As a person who was an atheist for many years and as a person who has taught in the public schools for some 41 years, I have a different perspective on some of these things than probably a lot of other people do. But I think it's important to understand why we're trying to do this. I generally get two kinds of skeptical reactions to the sort of things we try to do. One is the atheist who says, this is ridiculous. Nobody believes in God. Why should I waste my time looking at this kind of material? And I think that's rooted to a great extent in the fact that there's been a lot of stupidity out there. There's been a lot of bad arguments made. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I think there are some good arguments. And as a person who came to believe in God through my studies in science, I'd like to share with you some of the things that led me to move out of an atheistic orientation and into a believer one. For those of you who are perhaps already believers in God, there's another negative reaction that I sometimes get to these presentations, and that is, I believe in God. Why should I waste my time talking about this stuff? And I think there's two responses I'd like to make to that. The first one is, you need to know how to share your faith with others. And we live in a world where a lot of things are happening to cause people to have a lot of faith problems. And if we're to be ready to give an answer with the hope that is within us to every man, surely the question of how we know there's a God is part of that answer. But I think all of us have a problem with faith that reflects in how we act and what we do. I'd like to show you a little visual that I think represents the problems that we all have. We have a line here, sort of a sine wave line that goes up and down. And what that line represents is life. I don't know about you, but I have times when I have really good days. Man, everything's going great and I'm really on top of the world. And then there are those days when nothing goes right. And I really get pretty discouraged. I can become very, very negative about things. Life is highs and lows. And if you say, no, not me, I'm always just perfectly flat, I don't believe that. I think that people have hills and valleys. And in the Bible, for those of you who are believers, there's no question that the people who were instrumental in the establishment of the church and in following the teachings of Jesus had their highs and lows. I mean, look at Peter. One minute he's walking on the water, and the next minute it's, Lord, save me. One minute it says, I'll never deny you, and then the next minute, the cock crows. Life is ups and downs, whether you're an atheist, whether you're a believer. And for people who are believers, there's a question of vulnerability. At the bottom of this visual, we have an area that is labeled unbelief level. We all have an unbelief level. In the Bible, we see people saying like, Lord, help my unbelief. And I think it's important to understand that in today's world, there's lots of things that can push that unbelief level up, can increase it. Problems with a marriage, the death of somebody you love, the world situation, people doing stupid things that hurt you. Life has a tendency to produce unbelief in us. And for many people, that unbelief level has increased to such a point where it really saturates their life. And that's really the atheist view, that the area of unbelief is so large, there's so much evidence for it, that it has become their dominant faith. For those who are believers, there's a hope that we can push that unbelief level down. And I believe it's useful to look at a discussion like this with the idea of reducing our unbelief level, knowing how to answer the kinds of questions that would tend to produce unbelief. There's another perspective that I'd like to do as we introduce this series of videos, and that is that I think there's a mistaken concept of the relationship of faith and science, or how we view the Bible and science. And this visual sort of demonstrates what I think a lot of people believe. And I'm not restricting this to any particular group. I think you hear it from the pulpit. I think you see it in the media. And of course, there are atheists that would love to present this perspective, and that is that science and faith are antagonists, that they're on a collision course. There are popularizers of science who have essentially said, you have to decide whether you're to be a well-educated, logical, intelligent, thinking, scientific person, or whether you're going to be a believer in God. That these are opposing points of view. I think that's horribly destructive. As a teacher, I've had a lot of students over the years that struggle with this. I remember particularly one young man that I had in my class who was the son of a minister, and he was a terrific science student. He just had this tremendous natural ability to understand things scientifically, a tremendous mind with great quantitative analysis skills. And he was in getting some help one night on a problem in physics, and we worked through the problem, and then he saw it, and the little light came on, and he was, sort of enthusiastic. He said, man, I love this. I sure wish I could be a scientist. And I said, well, why can't you? I said, I would hope this would be your career. You're really good at this. He said, no, I want to be a Christian. And you see, what had happened was that somehow along the line, he had gotten the idea that he had to make a choice. And as I say, that's a terribly destructive perspective. You see, what I would suggest to you is that science and faith, science and our understanding of what the Bible says, are symbiotic relationships. They reinforce each other. They support each other. They aren't enemies. And I hope if you got nothing else out of this series of videos that we're hoping to get you to look at, that you'll see that there is a tremendous support for belief in God from the field of science. It led me to become a Christian. And I hope whether you're an atheist, whether you're an agnostic, whether you're a believer, that you'll find some things here that will be helpful and useful to you. Now, I'm not a philosopher. Well, we're all philosophers in a sense, but that's not my field of expertise. And so I just want to make one sort of generalized philosophical perspective to get you to understand a little bit about where we're coming from. I'm making one assumption philosophically about the things that we're going to be talking about. And this is an assumption. I admit that. I won't debate it with you. I won't argue it with you. If you want to debate this, you have to argue it with somebody else. But now, before you get to feeling this is going to be some big, heavy, difficult subject, let me show you what it is. Yeah. I just want you to be willing to admit that you exist, that there is reality. Now, if you're watching this set of videos and if you don't believe you exist, you got bigger problems than I want to deal with. And I fully understand that there's a valid philosophical perspective to this question. I run into this all the time. We're doing a series of lectures in a college or a university, and almost always somebody will raise this question. Well, how do you know you exist? And I understand the philosophical perspective, but I suggest to you that's not the way we make decisions. If you're standing in the middle of a street and a cement truck is bearing down on you, you don't stand there pondering the reality of your existence. You get out of the road. That's a practical, pragmatic approach to major questions, and that's what I'm asking you to apply here. You say, well, you can't prove God exists. Well, that's true in an absolute sense. In an absolute sense, you can't prove you exist. You say, well, look at me. And I say, well, how do I know you're not just a fancy hologram? I mean, if you want to play those kinds of games, and I think they are games, they're mental games, that's not a negative. But if you want to play those kind of games, then you really can't prove your own existence. But again, I say to you, that's not the way we make decisions. So no, we're not talking absolute proof here. What we're talking about is the weight of the evidence. And what I'd like to do is to show you a logical approach that I believe can be used in dealing with this question of how we know there's a God, what the evidence is. And this isn't going to be a biblical argument. It's not going to be a heavy philosophical approach. It's not going to be a major theological approach, although all of those things are obviously involved in anything we discuss. It's just going to be a basic, common sense, practical look at the questions. And so let's pursue this a little bit. If you admit that you exist, then I suggest that there are two possibilities about how that existence came into being. The top statement is a statement from a document put out by an atheistic group. And I think it eloquently summarizes the atheist position. That doesn't mean every atheist would agree with it, but I think it's a pretty concise statement of some of the fundamentals of atheist belief. The bottom statement is not offered as a proof of anything, and let me emphasize that. You know, when I was an atheist, I used to find that people somehow felt that if they quoted Scripture to me as an atheist, that was going to convince me about something. And I know that there are passages that talk about belief comes from hearing and hearing from the Word of God, but I think the context of that passage is different than what we're dealing with here. And if you're an atheist, I want to say to you, I'm not going to attempt to prove anything to you by quoting Scripture. So that's not why this is up. It is up because I think it is a very clear, concise statement, and especially in the original language, a concise statement of what those who believe in God hold to be true. So now let's take a look at each one of these. In the very first statement, we'll come back to these periodically as we go along in the development of our logical argument. The universe is eternal. Now, the important point here is that an atheist will maintain everything has always been basically as it is. Matter energy never had a beginning. It will never have an end. So the concept is that everything has basically always been in the form that it is, perhaps has changed forms from energy to matter or from some conceptual position to another, but that everything has always been, there was no beginning. Now, if you're a religious person looking at this, and if you say, well, that's kind of crazy, as an atheist, I would say to you, well, where did God come from? And if you were to say to me, well, God has always been, then my question to you has to be, why is it any more reasonable to believe that God has always been than it is to believe that matter has always been? And this was eloquently stated many years ago by Carl Sagan in his book Kosmos. So I think it's important to recognize that the atheist has a very valid position here, a good question. And in one of our later videos, we will talk about where did God come from? Because I think that's a valid question and one that is important in understanding the nature of God. But that's not our subject right now. Right now, I just want to point out to you, you can't just blow this off. Now, there's another perspective. And the other perspective, as we said, is taken from the Bible. But let's take a quick look at the literal meaning of these words. And what we've done in this chart is that we have taken the first 5 words of Genesis, and we have shown what the Hebrew word for each of those English statements is, the meaning that is given for these words taken from a lexicon, and how many times it is used that way. Now, the reason this is brought up is because the Hebrew word reshith is an eloquent statement of the opposing position to what we just saw. The word reshith literally refers to something that never existed before. So in short, the Bible is maintaining there was a beginning. So the atheist says there was no beginning. The believer says there was a beginning. This is a nice, clear, contradictory set of beliefs. How do we answer the question? My response to that is, look at the scientific evidence. And what we propose to do in the rest of this video and in the next one is to show you some of that evidence. So let's take a look at where we live. Now, we live on planet Earth. That's pretty obvious. But if you back away from planet Earth and planet Earth fades in the background, one of the things you become immediately aware of is that we are not alone. There are other objects out there. Objects that in many cases look like us. I mean, Mars looks a lot like us. It has polar caps, it has canyons, there's evidence that water existed on Mars. We may even find the precursors of life on Mars. The important thing to understand here is that not everything looks like us. When you move further out into the solar system, you see worlds that are very different. Jupiter, a world of liquids and gases and incredible cold. Saturn, a world that has such a low density that if you could put Saturn in your bathtub, it would float. Of course, you need one whale of a big bathtub. But the important thing to understand here is that this is a very different kind of world, although the moons of Jupiter and Saturn have conditions that are much more Earth-like in nature. But if you continue to move out of the solar system and go way out into space, you will find that there are other things out there that are radically larger and different than we are. And you're looking at one of them now. This is called a galaxy, and this is an actual photograph of a galaxy that looks very much like our galaxy. Our galaxy is called the Milky Way galaxy. And what you're looking at here is a galaxy that is very much like our Milky Way galaxy. You're looking at 100 billion stars. 100 billion. Let me give you a little handle on that. It has been less than 2 billion minutes since Jesus Christ was born. And there are 100 billion stars in the Milky Way galaxy. We are located about a third of the way out in a rotating system that is 100,000 light years, 588 quadrillion miles in diameter. The size is incredible. But if you were to continue to back away from the Milky Way galaxy, what you would find is there are other objects out there. This is our nearest major neighbor. It's called Andromeda. What you're looking at is another island universe, again of 100 billion stars. Over the years, science has found, as they have looked out into space with more and more powerful instruments, that these rotating universes, these galaxies that we refer to, are incredibly common. This is a picture showing you what things look like in what is called the Hercules cluster. Ladies and gentlemen, those spots of light are not stars. Those are galaxies. Every single spot you can see on your screen, however small and microscopic it might be, is a rotating system of 100 billion stars. 100,000 light years in diameter going about a central core. Some are larger, some are smaller, but that's the nature. And at the turn of this century, we have found with the Hubble telescope the magnitude of stars is just incredible. Here's a Hubble picture not too long ago showing you how dense it appears galaxies are. Now the reality is these things are millions of light years apart, billions of light years apart in many cases, but the important thing to understand is every spot of light is another galaxy. The size is incredible. What's interesting also about this is that these things are moving. And we can measure their movement. And they're all moving away from each other. We live in a universe that is expanding. Now in our little animation here, we have a triangle. And let's just suppose that there were 3 galaxies located at positions A, B, and C in that triangle. As we animate this, what you see happening is that the system is getting larger and larger. And it's not just that the galaxies are moving away from each other. Space itself is expanding. Let's suppose we put this in reverse now. Instead of the system expanding, let's suppose we run it backwards. Let's suppose we move it backwards in time. What would eventually happen? Well, it's pretty obvious, I think, that if you ran it backwards in time, it would eventually end up at an infinitely small point, a beginning. This is called a singularity. And it's important to understand that this is a beginning. It is exactly the question that we have been talking about. It is one of many arguments that demonstrate that we don't live in a universe that is made of matter energy that has existed eternally, that there was a specific beginning to the creation. Now, let me anticipate an atheist argument here, one I would certainly have made as an atheist. This is called the oscillating or pulsating universe. The idea here is, well, how do you know that the universe didn't start out the way you've described, but eventually it ends up stopping in its expansion, and then gravity pulls it all back together, and it becomes a singularity again, and then the process repeats all over again. How do you know we don't live in a universe that just expands and contracts and expands and contracts and expands and contracts forever? A universe that is eternal. There has always been a lot of discussion about this. But in the year 2000, a discovery was made by astronomers that is just absolutely astounding. What they did was that they started looking at the motion of the galaxies, because you see, we hadn't been looking at galaxies for very many years, and it was difficult to know how their motion changed. Did it slow down or not? And to their amazement, they found the universe is not slowing down. The universe is accelerating. In other words, everything is moving faster today than it was yesterday. Space is not slowing down. The gravitational processes that would decrease the expansion of the universe are being overcome, at least, by some kind of dark energy, it's sometimes called, some kind of additional process that is causing the universe to accelerate. Now, this is the frontier of what is happening in science. But the important thing to understand is that what it tells us is the universe will never collapse back on itself. We live in a universe that is accelerating. It will never return to its original position. So as you look back at this graphic, you have to understand that in reality what would happen is that instead of it being pulled back to a central point, it would expand forever. Now somebody says, well, what about parallel universes? How do you know that there aren't many universes and that what is happening is that matter energy is moving back and forth between universes? Well, all that does is expand the question of the creation. In other words, if we have many universes and material somehow moves between those universes, the question of creation, the question of the beginning, is the beginning of all the parallel universes. And it's important to understand also that we have absolutely, at least at the time we're making this video, not one shred of evidence that such a thing exists. But even if it does exist, even if tomorrow, after we've made this video, it's discovered there is evidence, the question doesn't change. The question of beginning is the beginning of time, space, matter, energy, the whole cosmos as a whole, however many universes might be involved or responsible within it. There's evidence here that we had a beginning. Now, there are many other questions that can be raised. One of the questions says, well, what about the Big Bang? And let me tell you the story to show you how clear this evidence is. When I was a kid, I wasn't a very nice kid. And one of my favorite projects was blowing things up with firecrackers. I used to put firecrackers in soup cans and blow them out of sight. I was good at it. And one day, some of my little buddies were out in the backyard, and I decided to play a big joke on them. I was going to throw a mud ball, an explosive mud ball at them. Now, for those of you who aren't that mean and that nasty, let me explain that. What you do is you take a firecracker and you put it in a big ball of gooky mud. And you let the firecracker burn down, and then you heave the mud ball with the firecracker in it up in the air, and when it explodes, it throws mud all over the place. And for some reason, at 13 years of age or whatever I was, I thought that was going to be a lot of fun, and I was going to get mud all over my buddies. And so I made this mud ball, and I put the firecracker inside, I lit the fuse, I let it burn down, and I heaved it out the garage window in the backyard where they were playing. The only problem was I hit the window. And the firecracker and the mud ball bounced back over my head and landed in my mother's baby blue Volkswagen convertible. There was a big bang, followed by a whole bunch of little bangs on my rear end. And the pattern that was in that baby blue Volkswagen convertible was exactly the pattern that you saw in the picture of the Big Bang. I know because I spent many, many hours with a bucket, a spick and span, and an assorted number of brushes cleaning the inside of that car. Now, the question I think has to be raised here, the point that needs to be made is, what does the Big Bang have to do with the question about which we're talking? You know, somehow religious people seem to feel that this is some kind of a big problem, that the Big Bang theory is some kind of an opposition to their belief system. But the question remains, what blew up? The Big Bang theory is a clear demonstration that there was a beginning. The evidence of the expanding universe supports the Big Bang theory, but it still raises the basic question of what was the source of the explosion. Could God have used an explosion to shape the universe as we see it? I would suggest to you that a well-educated atheist will hate the Big Bang theory because it doesn't answer the question about which we're talking. And the important concept involved here is that this is just one small evidence that there was a beginning. One small evidence in the support system that we're looking at that raises questions about a logical argument for the existence of God. In our second video, what we would like to do is to show you some more evidence that there was a beginning, anticipate some of the questions that might follow with that, and then move from that into a discussion that has to do with how that leads to other choices that suggest the concept of the existence of God. Now, we want to emphasize that this video is just an introduction. It's just a beginning. We hope that you'll continue through the videos. We'd also like to mention that the contents of this video is available in a booklet, which is titled A Practical Man's Proof of God. We have this booklet as well as other materials available completely free of charge. We're not a business. We don't want to sell you anything. We just would like for you to look at some of the evidence that we believe is available and hope that this will be helpful and useful to you. So we're going to give you some information, and we hope you'll be willing to respond to that and to request some of this information and to join us in the next presentation when we'll look at not only how we know there was a beginning, but what was the cause of that beginning. Thanks for being with us.
Does God Exist is an educational program which attempts to provide evidence that man can logically believe in God and that the Christian system presented in the New Testament is the best option for successful living. We offer materials free and on loan. Contact us by mail, fax, or email for a catalog, to request materials, or just to ask questions. Does God exist may be the most important question you will ever ask.